Hello and welcome to this talk, which will be on some theory by Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud on what at the time they called hysteria. And for this talk, as you can see, I'm going to be referring to their book Studies on Hysteria, and particularly I'm going to be using the very first 18 pages of this book, which is their preliminary communication, which was actually published in 1893. So why do a talk on this? Well, personally, I just wanted to consolidate some of the learning I've been doing whilst reading Freud. Secondly, this text, Studies on Hysteria, is a classic psychotherapy text, so it's historically relevant if you're interested in therapy. But probably most importantly, some of the ideas in here I found surprisingly relevant and still very similar to modern training in trauma work and modern theories on trauma. So if you're interested in that, let's dig in. Here's a picture of Freud, for what it's worth, in 1891. So, what were they doing? They were investigating a great variety of different forms and symptoms of hysteria with a view to discovering their precipitating cause, that is, the event which provoked the first occurrence, which was often many years earlier. They say it's not possible to establish the point of origin by simple interrogation of the patient, principally because he is genuinely unable to recollect it. So if you say to many people, why are you showing these symptoms, what first caused them, they might just draw a blank. They don't know. They can't remember. So they found that it's necessary to hypnotize these patients and to arouse his memories under hypnosis of the time at which the symptom first made its appearance. And then it becomes possible to demonstrate the connection between the hysterical symptom and this original cause or event in the clearest and most convincing fashion. External events determine the pathology of hysteria to an extent far greater than is known and recognized. So what they were calling hysteria at this time, many people, physicians, therapists, believed that there were no causes, at least no causes in terms of the events of these patients' lives. They're just sort of random occurrences or maybe physiological determined illnesses. It's of course obvious that in the case of traumatic hysteria, what provokes the symptoms is the accident. So if you have a very clear event where hysterical or traumatic symptoms immediately follow, they were calling this traumatic hysteria, and they were saying, well, of course, that in that case it's kind of obvious, right? So if someone's just come back from war and they're jumping at the sound of a car backfiring, it's pretty clear that the symptoms they're showing are the effects of their experiences during war. The causal connection is equally evident in hysterical attacks when it is possible to gather from the patient's utterances that in each attack he is hallucinating the same event which provoked the first one. So if whilst the person is hallucinating during a hysterical attack, and during that hallucination they're talking, and in what they're saying, they're clearly telling you or giving you massive clues as to the event in their life that they might be hallucinating in that moment, then also it might be quite obvious that the hysterical attack was caused by the event which they're now hallucinating back to. You might think of this as a flashback, maybe. The most various symptoms, which are ostensibly spontaneous and idiopathic, are just as strictly related to the precipitating trauma as the phenomena to which we have just alluded and which exhibit the connection quite clearly. So what they're laying out here is that they're saying all these other cases of hysteria where the initial event isn't so obvious, or there aren't obvious hallucinations which describe the event that caused the symptoms, that even those cases are just as caused by real external experiences these people have been through. They're not just physiologically caused. So I've mentioned hysteria and hysterical attacks a number of times now, but what are we actually referring to? What were the symptoms which at the time they labelled as hysteria or hysterical? Well, there was neuralgias, so this is nerve pain, anesthesias, loss of sensation or awareness, contractures, which is the involuntary shortening of a muscle or joint, paralyses, where you can't move something or move a part of your body, hysterical attacks. I think they're be what we might call panic attacks nowadays, but I think could probably also include hallucinations. And epileptoid convulsions, so epileptic type convulsing, tics, chronic vomiting and maybe anorexia, disturbances of vision, and hallucinations. So these are the things we're talking about when we're talking about hysteria. Really quite severe and unpleasant symptoms for these clients and patients. The disproportion between the many years' duration of the hysterical symptom and the single occurrence which provoked it is what we are accustomed invariably to find in traumatic neuroses, quite frequently some event in childhood. So they're accustomed in traumatic neuroses which follow some sort of trauma. They're accustomed to find that one relatively short, perhaps, event leads to many months or years of symptoms. So there's a disproportion there. Then they give some examples. I've put the examples in green. So a painful emotion arising during a meal but was suppressed at the time then produced nausea and vomiting which persisted for months. Or another example, a girl watching beside a sick bed in a torment of anxiety fell into a twilight state and had a terrifying hallucination while her right arm, which was hanging over the back of her chair, went to sleep. From there developed a paresis of the same arm, accompanied by contracture and anesthesia. So paresis is not quite a paralysis, but a weakness in the voluntary movement. So you can't move it very much, and it was contracted and she couldn't feel it, right? So it went to sleep while she had a difficult emotional event, and then it persisted in that same sort of state for much time afterwards. In other cases, the connection is not so simple. It consists in what only might be called a symbolic relation between the precipitating cause and the pathological phenomenon. For example, vomiting upon a feeling of moral disgust. So there's a symbolic connection between feeling morally disgusted but actually physically vomiting, whereas the previous examples were more physically connected rather than symbolically connected. In traumatic neuroses, the operative cause of the illness is not the trifling physical injury, but the affect of fright, the psychical trauma. I thought that was so interesting because that is still really emphasized in modern trauma training, where people might assume it's the external event which is traumatic. It's the assault, the war, the car crash, which is inherently traumatic. But we're taught to remember it's how the nervous system reacts to that experience, the actual emotion and the nervous system response which defines it as trauma or not the objectiveness of the event. and this was highlighted all the way back in 1893. So in an analogous manner, most hysterical symptoms have precipitating causes which can only be described as psychical traumas. So they're saying hysterical symptoms are caused by trauma, and by trauma, by definition, we mean a psychical trauma. We mean an emotional response we can't handle, a nervous system overwhelm. So any experience which calls up distressing affects, fright, anxiety, shame, psychical pain. So they're saying here that these hysterical symptoms that we covered are caused by trauma, psychological trauma. Each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked, and in arousing its accompanying affect, so affect being the emotion, and when the patient had described that event in the greatest possible detail and had put that affect or emotion into words. Recollection without affect almost invariably produced no results. The psychical process which originally took place must be repeated as vividly as possible, then given verbal utterance. I put in pink phrases I thought were most important and most interesting. So this is still so relevant to modern trauma theory, right? That if we just provoke the emotion of a trauma, that can be re-traumatizing. Equally, if we're able to put stories into words, but it's completely dissociated from the feeling of the experience, that is not processing the trauma. It's the combination of accessing the feeling, but keeping it contained in a story in words. And that is still at the heart of modern trauma therapies, whether it's EMDR, somatic experiencing. It's all about feeling the experience and putting it into words. It's so one of the key aspects of modern trauma theory. Phenomena involving stimuli, such as spasms, neuralgias, and hallucinations, these reappear once again with the fullest intensity and then vanish forever. So during this experience where we've re-evoked the original memory of the trauma, the patient is feeding it again and putting it into language and putting the emotion into language. They're saying here that the symptoms reappear with their full intensity but then vanish forever. Failures of function, so the paralyses and the anesthesias, also vanish. So it's quite the claim, right? They're saying we can heal trauma, we can heal hysteria, because we understand where it comes from and how it works. So part 2. At first sight, it seems extraordinary that events experienced so long ago should continue to operate so intensely, that their recollection should not be liable to the wearing away process that we see most memories succumb to. So yeah, why do these memories continue to operate with such intensity for so long? The fading of a memory, or the losing of its affect, depends on various factors, so we're going to look into those. So firstly, whether there has been an energetic reaction to the event that provokes an affect. So if something provokes a strong emotion in me, am I allowed to express that emotion? For example, with tears or even an act of revenge, then these emotions are discharged. This comes out in our language, such as to cry oneself out or to blow off steam. If the reaction is suppressed, the affect or the emotion remains attached to the memory. So number 1 then, if we suppress the emotion, if we aren't able to express it, that can stay attached to the memory and it doesn't fade away like normal memories might. Number 2, language can serve as a substitute for this action. By its help, the emotion can be abreacted, so it can be expressed. For example, a confession. If there is no such reaction, whether in deeds or words, or in the mildest cases in tears, any recollection of the event retains its affective tone to begin with. So basically saying we need some form of emotional expression, and that can take the form of language. I can talk about what happened, and that can be a way of expressing the emotion. Number 3, a memory of such a trauma, even if it has not been abreacted, enters the great complex of associations. It comes alongside other experiences which may contradict it, and is subjected to rectification by other ideas. So let's look at some examples to see what this means. After an accident, for example, the memory of the danger and the mitigated repetition of the fright becomes associated with the memory of what happened afterwards, rescue, and the consciousness of present safety. So I put here conditioning, right? This seems like a behavioural principle that if I have safety and rescue associated with my memory of fright, then it might decondition the fear or the fright. A person's memory of a humiliation is corrected by his putting the facts right, by considering his own worth. So if that previous one was more of a behavioural principle, this is more of a cognitive therapy principle, right? If I can reevaluate the assumptions and beliefs I have applied to the situation by considering my other principles and other situations I've been through, I might be able to reconstruct the story of what happened to me, and that might help the emotion of the memory fade. So we call this cognitive restructuring in cognitive therapy. In this way, a normal person is able to bring about the disappearance of the accompanying affect or emotion through this process of association. On the other hand, the memories which have become the determinants of hysterical phenomena persist for a long time with astonishing freshness. So presumably, these 3 things don't happen. These memories, unlike other memories, are not at the patient's disposal. These experiences are completely absent from the patient's memory when they are in a normal psychical state, or are only present in a highly summary form. Not until they have been questioned under hypnosis do these memories emerge with the undiminished vividness of a recent event. So, memories that seem to be the causes of the symptoms of hysteria, hysterical symptoms, seem to be completely inaccessible to these patients' consciousness unless under hypnosis. So here's some examples. For 6 whole months, one of our patients reproduced under hypnosis with hallucinatory vividness everything that had excited her on the same day of the previous year during an attack of acute hysteria. A diary kept by her mother without her knowledge proved the completeness of these hallucinations. So there seems to be proof that this person's memories were true, that they really happened, but they were only accessible to her under hypnosis. Another patient relived with hallucinatory clarity all the events of a hysterical psychosis which she had passed through 10 years earlier, and which she had for the most part forgotten till the moment at which it re-emerged. These memories correspond to traumas that have not been sufficiently abreacted, so that have not gone through one of these 3 processes we talked through, right? They didn't have the capacity or the availability to express the emotions, either in words or otherwise, and these events weren't allowed to be associated to other events in their mind for them to be able to sort of correct them through maybe a cognitive process or some sort of conditioning, almost as if they were separate, they were kept separate in the mind. So we find at least two sets of conditions under which the reaction to the trauma fails to occur. So number one, because the nature of the trauma excluded a reaction. For example, social circumstances made a reaction impossible, or because it was a question of things which the patient wished to forget and therefore intentionally repressed. So in this case, we've not been able to express something either because social circumstances make it uncomfortable. So for example, if I'm in a culture where boys can't cry, then maybe I hide back my tears and I force them inside. Or if I'm very ashamed of what happened and I wish to forget it, I might intentionally push it away, repress it out of my mind. It is precisely distressing things of this kind that under hypnosis we find are the basis of hysterical phenomena. For example, hysterical deliria in saints and nuns, continent women, and well-brought-up children. Okay, so there's something here about very strict moral codes or upbringings which might have us push away experiences, thoughts, feelings which we consider immoral, what we are too ashamed to be aware of, so we repress them. Number two, the second group of conditions are determined by the psychical states in which the patient received the experiences. For under hypnosis, among the causes of hysterical symptoms, we find ideas which are not in themselves significant, but whose persistence is due to the fact that they originated during the prevalence of severely paralyzing affects, such as fright, or during positively abnormal psychical states, such as the semi-hypnotic twilight state of daydreaming, auto-hypnoses, and so on. It is the nature of these states which makes a reaction to the event impossible. So I might not be able to respond because I'm paralyzed, right? Basically, this is what we would now call the freeze response, or I might have so completely dissociated that I can't respond. So dissociation, freeze, the sort of playing dead response, that tonic immobility response. If my body has gone into some sort of shutdown through this traumatic experience, I then can't express the other emotions. Well, I can't express the emotions that might have gone on with that. They also include here abnormal states such as sort of semi-hypnotic states of daydreaming or auto-hypnoses. So almost implying if we've accidentally hypnotized ourselves, we might be more vulnerable to not being able to then express strong emotion if something then happens to us while we're sort of caught off guard. And they say both these conditions might be simultaneously present. In many people, a psychical trauma produces one of these states, which in turn makes a reaction impossible. So that's like the first condition I described, right, where our nervous system is overwhelmed, so we go into freeze, shutdown, tonic immobility, excessive people-pleasing mode, Stockholm syndrome. Like, we do what we have to do to survive, whether consciously or involuntarily, and then we can't express our fright, our anger, our tears, our pain. Psychical traumas which have not been disposed of by reaction cannot be disposed of either by being worked over by means of association. In the first group, the patient is determined to forget the distressing experiences and accordingly excludes them so far as possible from association. So basically, if I've suppressed or repressed the event, then it's not available to the rest of my consciousness to think it over, right? I've pushed it away. I don't want to think about it, so I can't make associations and work it over in the way I might do otherwise. Ideas which have become pathological have persisted with such freshness and affective strength because they have been denied the normal wearing away processes by means of abreaction and reproduction in states of uninhibited association. So that's a summary there. that an experience which is traumatic may persist with fresh, continuing symptoms and strong emotion for months and years because it's been repressed in some way and it's not been able to be affected by the normal wearing away processes by being able to express that emotion and by connecting that experience with other experiences in our lives so we can integrate it into a story. Again, this is so relevant today with modern trauma theory. So part 3. The splitting of consciousness is present to a rudimentary degree in every hysteria. A tendency to such a dissociation, and with it the emergence of abnormal states of consciousness, which we shall bring together under the term hypnoid, is the basic phenomena of this neurosis. So we just said in this summary, right, that experiences have been repressed and they've almost been cornered off. They've not been integrated into the story of the rest of our life. And so to this degree, they've been split off from consciousness. The basis and sine qua non of hysteria is the existence of these hypnoid states. If hypnoid states of this kind are already present before the onset of the manifest illness, they provide the soil in which the affect plants the pathogenic memory with its consequent somatic phenomena. This corresponds to dispositional hysteria. So they're kind of saying that maybe in some people we already have a split off bit of consciousness, so to speak, and therefore if we have a traumatic experience, that repressed experience already has somewhere to go. So we're almost predisposed to hysteria or to post-traumatic symptoms in this way. I don't know how much that corresponds to modern trauma therapy. It's an intriguing idea. A severe trauma or a laborious suppression can bring about a splitting off of groups of ideas, even in people who are in other respects unaffected. So yeah, that's what we've already covered, right? If you have some traumatic experience, you might be prone, or you're continually suppressing something, maybe out of shame, you might create in yourself a split off bit of your psyche where these ideas live. This would be the mechanism of psychically acquired hysteria. Between the extremes of these two forms, we must assume the existence of a series of cases. So, section 4. What we have asserted of chronic hysterical symptoms can be applied almost completely to hysterical attacks. Charcot has given us a schematic description of the major hysterical attack, according to which 4 phases can be distinguished in a complete attack. Number 1, the epileptoid phase, so presumably some sort of convulsion. Number 2, the phase of large movements. Number 3, the hallucinatory phase. Could try to read this French, couldn't I? Attitude passionnelle. And 4, the phase of terminal delirium. So our attempted explanation takes its start from the third of these phases, that of the attitude passionnelle. So this hallucinatory phase. It exhibits the hallucinatory reproduction of a memory, which was of importance in bringing about the onset of hysteria. So in this phase, the person hallucinates the original, or re-experiences, you in modern language you might call this a flashback, right? They re-experience the original trauma. There are also attacks, however, which appear to consist exclusively of the motor phenomena, and in which the third phase, I won't say it again, is absent. If one can succeed in getting into rapport with the patient during an attack of this, or if one can provoke the attack under hypnosis, one finds that here too there is an underlying memory. So he's saying that sometimes these attacks only show these movements, right, the convulsions, But if you get in rapport with the client and if you can speak to them, then you can perhaps get them to relive or even tell the story. That's an interesting idea. So, for example, a little girl suffered for years from attacks of general convulsions which were regarded as epileptic. She was hypnotized and promptly had one of her attacks. She was asked what she was seeing and replied, the dog's coming. And in fact, it turned out that she had had the first of her attacks after being chased by a savage dog. The success of the treatment confirmed the choice of diagnosis. Can you imagine? They thought this girl was epileptic, she was having seizures. Turns out she was traumatized, and under hypnosis they were able to process the trauma. An employee who had become a hysteric as a result of being ill-treated by his superior suffered from attacks in which he collapsed and fell into a frenzy of rage, but without uttering a word or giving a sign of a hallucination. It was possible to provoke an attack under hypnosis, and the patient then revealed that he was living through the scene in which his employer had abused him in the street and hit him with a stick. A few days later, the patient came back and complained of having had an attack of the same kind. On this occasion, it turned out under hypnosis that he had been reliving the scene to which the actual onset of the illness was related, the scene in the law court when he failed to obtain satisfaction for his maltreatment. So this guy had been having rage attacks, and under hypnosis, they linked together that these rage attacks were originally triggered by this being attacked by a superior at work, assaulted, and then failing to get justice for this attack in the law court. Which you can imagine would be a horrible experience. In hysteria, groups of ideas originating in hypnoid states are present and are cut off from associative connection with other ideas, but can be associated among themselves, and thus form a more or less highly organised rudiment of a second consciousness, a condition seconde. A chronic hysterical symptom will correspond to the intrusion of this second state into the somatic innervation, which is, as a rule, under the control of normal consciousness. A hysterical attack, on the other hand, is evidence of a higher organisation of this second state. Okay, so we've said already, haven't we, that in this traumatic state, part of our consciousness is split off, and they're calling this split off bit of consciousness a second consciousness, a condition seconde. And when we have traumatic or hysterical symptoms which are somatic, so the contracting of muscles or the anesthesias, this is when this second consciousness has sort of slipped out into a bit of our nervous system. Whereas a hysterical attack is when this second consciousness has come right to the driver's seat and has just taken full control of the consciousness. Normal consciousness is not always entirely repressed. It may even be aware of the motor phenomenon of the attack while the accompanying psychical events are outside its knowledge. So I might be aware that I'm having a convulsion or that a part of my body is paralysed. So to that degree, I'm aware of that second condition, that second bit of consciousness. But I might not be aware of the events, the experience that originally caused the symptoms. And again, this is completely in line with modern trauma theory, where we have dissociation, of course, but that can be on a spectrum of integration. And in fact, the aim of trauma treatment is to help integrate these split off dissociated parts into full awareness in a contained way within someone's tolerance level. Lastly then, part 5, how is it that the psychotherapeutic procedure which we have described in these pages has a curative effect? Well, it brings to an end the operative force of the idea which was not abreacted in the first instance, by allowing its strangulated affect to find a way out through speech, and it subjects it to associative correction by introducing it into normal consciousness. So, they're summarising their trauma treatment or their hysteria treatment, right? They're saying that through their methods they're able to tap into this split off or dissociated bit of consciousness, allowing the emotion that's trapped in there to come out, but not just come out haphazardly, but come out in a processed way through, and by putting words to that emotion and to the experience through which this trauma first appeared. And it allows all that experience into conscious awareness, which can then be integrated into normal consciousness. So again, very key idea that's still part of modern trauma treatments. And last thing we have to say then is it seems to us far superior in its efficacy to removal through direct suggestion, as it is practiced today by psychotherapists. So what they're saying here is that a treatment you might have been able to have gotten at the time was hypnosis, sure, but in that hypnosis you were just given suggestions that your symptoms abate, for example, suggestions to feel an arm that might be paralysed. But in that you're not actually getting to the heart of the trauma at all, you're just trying to change the symptom. Which is kind of like the argument in modern day that if you didn't realise someone had trauma and you were applying just basic cognitive or behavioural techniques to trauma symptoms, it's the same sort of thing, right? You're just putting a plaster on a deeper wound which needs to be healed from a much deeper place from the original experience of this trauma. So, I hope that was interesting, helpful. It certainly has been for me. Thanks very much. See you next time.